London, 1939. A young naval intelligence officer sat down and wrote a memo. He was not yet famous. The character that would make his name, the spy with the license to kill, the martini, the impossible escapes, did not yet exist. He was simply a man with an unusual imagination and a job that rewarded unusual imaginations. The memo was called the Trout Paper. It contained 54 suggestions for deceiving the enemy. Most were conventional, some were strange. One, suggestion number 28, was something else entirely. It read, a corpse dressed as an officer with dispatches in his pockets could be dropped on the coast, supposedly from a parachute that had failed. Of course, it would have to be a fresh corpse. Ian Fleming wrote that sentence and moved on to suggestion 29. 4 years later, someone else read it, and what they built from that single sentence, from a dead man, a briefcase, a chain, and the predictable tides off the coast of southern Spain, would fool Adolf Hitler, save 153 lives, and give the most useful death of the Second World War to a man who had died alone in an abandoned warehouse without a single person who knew his name. This is the story of the man who never was, and the war he won without ever knowing he was fighting it. By 1943, the Allies had a problem that no amount of military force could solve. They needed to invade Europe through the Mediterranean. Sicily was the obvious target, the stepping stone between North Africa and the Italian mainland, the geographical inevitability that any competent strategist looking at a map would identify within 30 seconds. The Germans knew it, Mussolini knew it. The entire Axis intelligence apparatus was watching Sicily with the concentrated attention of people who correctly identified where the blow was coming from and were preparing to receive it. The Allied forces that landed on a defended Sicily against prepared German positions against the full weight of an Axis military that had correctly anticipated the invasion, those forces were going to bleed. The projection said 90 days to take the island. 90 days at a specific, grinding, attritional violence of men fighting for ground that neither side could afford to lose. The only solution was to make Hitler believe that the obvious target was a trap, that the real invasion was coming somewhere else, that the map was lying to him and the men had been telling him to watch Sicily were wrong. To do that, they needed Hitler to believe something that was not true. And to make him believe it, they needed evidence, specific, detailed, credible evidence, the kind that came not from signals intelligence or informants, but from documents, physical documents, letters between senior Allied officers recovered from the sea that pointed unmistakably away from Sicily and towards somewhere else entirely. They needed the documents to be real enough to fool the best intelligence analysts in Germany. And they needed them to be found on someone who was completely beyond suspicion. They needed a dead man. The man who turned Fleming's suggestion into an operation was Charles Cholmondeley, a British MI5 intelligence officer with the specific combination of creativity and bureaucratic persistence that complex deceptions require. He was joined by Ewan Montague, a naval intelligence officer who had the connections and the authority to navigate the institutional machinery that turning a corpse into a British officer would inevitably require. Together, they worked through the problem with the methodical attention to detail of men who understood that the entire operation would succeed or fail on the quality of its fabrication. A dead man dropped in the sea with documents in his briefcase was not by itself convincing. A dead man with a complete and internally consistent life, an identity, a history, a fiancé, love letters, a nightclub pass, a bank overdraft notice, the specific accumulated detritus of a real human existence was a different proposition entirely. They needed someone to be, and they needed someone who was already not. The search for a suitable corpse was conducted with the practical efficiency of people who had compartmentalised the moral dimensions of what they were doing in favour of the operational ones. The requirements were specific. The body had to be fresh enough to pass autopsy. The cause of death had to be consistent with drowning or exposure, the kind of death that a man might plausibly die in a plane crash over the sea. And it had to be someone whose absence from the world would not generate questions. They found Glyndwr Michael.
He was 34 years old, Welsh. Both his parents were dead. He had been living on the streets of London, or not living exactly, but existing in the particular way that people exist when the structures that connect a human life to other human lives have been removed one by one until nothing remains. In January 1943, he was found in an abandoned warehouse in King's Cross. He had eaten rat poison, whether accidentally, in desperation, or deliberately, the record does not clearly establish. He died in hospital 2 days later. He died without anyone who would notice he was gone. He died without a name that anyone would look for. The pathologist who examined the cause of death noted that the rat poison had caused liver damage consistent with the kind of gradual physiological deterioration that could, in the right circumstances, be interpreted as consistent with immersion in seawater. Cholmondeley and Montague had their man. What followed was one of the most extraordinary acts of fabrication in the history of intelligence work, the construction from nothing of a complete human identity for a man who was dead. Major William Martin of the Royal Marines, 34 years old, engaged to a woman named Pam, whose photograph and love letters would be found in his pockets. A regular at a nightclub in London whose pass was in his wallet. A man with a bank overdraft, because a man without financial problems is a man without the texture of a real life. The documents in his briefcase were carefully constructed over weeks by some of the most senior figures in British military intelligence. A letter from General Archibald Nye to General Harold Alexander that referred in the careful oblique language of men who knew their correspondence might be intercepted to plans for invasions of Greece and Sardinia. Plans that did not exist, described in language that sounded exactly like the language of men who were trying to be careful about plans that did. Every detail was considered. Every element of Major William Martin's life was constructed to withstand the scrutiny of German intelligence analysts who would be looking for exactly the kind of inconsistency that would reveal a fabrication. And then Glyndwr Michael, who had never been a major, never been in the Royal Marines, never had a fiancée named Pam or a nightclub pass or an overdraft or any of the things that constitute a life that other people can recognise, was dressed in the uniform of the man he had become and placed in a sealed canister aboard the submarine HMS Seraph. On April 29, 1943, off the coast of Huelva in southern Spain, he was pushed into the water. The choice of Huelva was not accidental. The tides and currents off the Spanish coast were predictable enough that the body would wash ashore within a day or two. Spain was officially neutral but practically sympathetic to the Axis, and British intelligence knew that a German Abwehr agent was active in the area, the kind of man who would make sure that interesting documents recovered from the sea reached the right people in Madrid and eventually Berlin. A Spanish fisherman found the body the following day. The local authorities recovered it. A British vice-consul attended the autopsy, at which Major William Martin of the Royal Marines was officially determined to have died at sea. He was buried in Huelva with full military honours, the honours due to an officer whose rank and service were entirely fictional, rendered by people who had no way of knowing that. The briefcase and its contents made their way to Madrid. The Spanish military held them for longer than the British would have preferred. Then the documents reached the German Abwehr. The analysts examined them. The analysts concluded they were genuine. On May 8, 1943, British intelligence received a message that remains one of the most satisfying sentences in the history of military deception. Mincemeat swallowed rod, line and sinker by the right people, and they look like they're acting on it. Hitler read the documents. Hitler believed them. On May 14th, Grand Admiral Dönitz recorded in his war diary that the Führer did not agree with Mussolini that Sicily was the most likely invasion point, that the discovered British orders confirmed the assumption that the planned attacks would be directed mainly against Greece. Hitler moved 7 infantry divisions to Greece. He doubled his forces in Sardinia. He relocated torpedo boats and panzer divisions away from Sicily. On July 9, 1943, the Allies landed in Sicily. The Germans were in the wrong place. The campaign that had been projected to last 90 days took 38.
Here is the question that the history of Operation Mincemeat has never fully resolved. And it is a question worth sitting with because its answer changes what the operation actually means. Did it work? Not in the mechanical sense. The documents reached Germany. Hitler believed them. German forces were moved away from Sicily. In that sense, it worked precisely as designed. But the deeper question is whether those German troop movements actually changed the outcome of the Sicily invasion, whether the 38 days instead of 90 were because of mincemeat, or whether they would have been 38 days anyway. Hitler had feared an Allied invasion of the Balkans before mincemeat. He had been skeptical of Mussolini's military judgment for years. The reinforcement of Greece and Sardinia may have reflected those pre-existing fears as much as it reflected the documents in Major William Martin's briefcase. The British historian Ben Macintyre, who wrote the definitive account of Operation Mincemeat, offered the only honest answer available. Of the 160,000 Allied soldiers who took part in the invasion and conquest of Sicily, more than 153,000 were still alive at the end. That so many survived was due in no small measure to a man who died 7 months earlier. In no small measure, not entirely, not definitively, in no small measure. An operation that may have been partially unnecessary, a deception that may have reinforced fears that already existed rather than creating new ones. A dead man who may or may not have been the decisive factor in an outcome that may have been partially determined by other variables entirely. And 153,000 men who came home.
Glyndwr Michael is buried in the municipal cemetery of Huelva in southern Spain. For years, his grave bore only the name of the man he had become, Major William Martin, Royal Marines. The real name was classified. The operation was classified. The homeless Welshman who had died in an abandoned warehouse in London remained, officially, the man who never was. In 1998, the British government declassified the operation and acknowledged the real identity of the man in a grave. The headstone now carries both names, Major William Martin, and beneath it, the real name, Glyndwr Michael. Served as the real Major William Martin. Served as. The specific grammar of that inscription, not was, not became, but served as, contains the entire moral complexity of what Operation Mincemeat actually was. A man who had no agency in his own life and no agency in his own death was given a posthumous purpose by people who needed a body with the right characteristics at the right moment. He did not choose to serve, he did not volunteer. He was selected because he was available and because the cause of his death could be made consistent with drowning. And he saved 153,000 lives. The operation that used him may have been partially unnecessary. The German troop movements it caused may have been partially determined by fears that predated the documents in his briefcase. History is full of this kind of ambiguity. The decisive action that may not have been quite as decisive as the people who ordered it believed. The dead man whose death may have mattered somewhat less or somewhat more than the inscription on his gravestone suggests. What is not ambiguous is the number. 153,000 men who were alive at the end of a campaign that had been projected to kill many of them. 153,000 futures that continued past July 1943. The children born, the lives lived,
the ordinary accumulation of human existence that happens when the men who were supposed to die in the first 90 days of a campaign survived to the 38th instead.
Glyndwr Michael had none of that. He died at 34 in an abandoned warehouse, alone, without anyone who would notice. He did not know what his death would become. He did not know that the body he left behind would be dressed in someone else's uniform and given someone else's name and sent to the bottom of the Mediterranean, carrying documents that would move 7 German infantry divisions to the wrong country. He did not know any of it. He simply died, and the people who found his body decided that his death was too useful to waste. History remembers Major William Martin. The grave in Welver now remembers Glyndwr Michael too. But what history struggles to process, what the clean narrative of Operation Mincemeat tends to obscure, is the specific human cost of what useful deaths actually cost. The operation may have been partially unnecessary. It saved 153 lives anyway. And the man who made it possible never knew he was fighting, never knew he was needed, never knew that the death he died alone in a warehouse in London would become, in the accounting of the Second World War, one of the most consequential deaths of the entire conflict. Some men are remembered for what they did. Glyndwr Michael is remembered for what was done with him after he was gone. The grave in Welver has 2 names on it now. That is the least history could do. It is also, in some ways, the most. If you want to know what the Second World War actually cost, not in the clean language of strategy and outcome, but in the specific, irreducible human currency of lives used and lives saved and lives that never got to be counted either way, the grave in Welver is a place to start. 2 names, 1 stone, and the question of whether the operation was necessary that history has never fully answered. 153,000 men came home. That is the only answer that matters, and the only one Glyndwr Michael never got to hear.
If this story stayed with you, if the grave in Welver and the 2 names and the 153,000 mean something to you, there are more of them waiting. Every war, every empire, every death that changed everything. Subscribe to Dash History and stay.